is my report to the church annual meetings for 2020 in these unusual circumstances where we can't really meet together as we would like. Now, in my report to the APCM, the main annual meeting last year, I was able to articulate a simple vision for the church that I'd really been groping towards since I arrived here in late 2015. I said that we had to be a church for the whole community. It was as simple as that. Of course, St Andrew's always has been a church for the whole community and done so successfully in many ways. But I thought then, and I still think now, that we need to express that openly and pursue it intentionally. Being a church for the whole community means a number of things. It means that our pattern of worship has to embrace variety. We should aim for our pastoral care to reach out beyond the church family, and there should be intentional reaching out in other ways too. As we redevelop the church building, as I'm sure in time we will, we need to make sure that it serves the needs of the whole community and not just the worshipping community. And you'll remember that these were all things we were working on before lockdown. Now, of course, COVID-19 has entirely changed our world. It's not just our ability to socialise that has changed, but everything about our worlds of work, health, education, legal services, travel, shopping and more. And so too has church. But nonetheless, the aim, even with all these changes, is still to be a church for the whole community. What we've needed to think about is how COVID has adjusted what that might look like. The principle remains the same, to be a church for the whole community, but we need to look at the practice. Normally I would start my report at the annual meeting with my take about what has gone on in the previous year. This time round there seems little point in spending too much time doing that, so a short summary only. Suffice it to say that 2019, remember that year? It was a good year. Things settled down from what was a difficult year the year before. We continued with our project to reach out to the community in an intentional way. We began to think about the future of our buildings, coming up with a draft set of principles which we then conducted a survey on to the congregation and then to the community. The still relatively new ventures of Messy Church and Connect continued to flourish. We had excellent visiting preachers. Remember our series on science and Christianity? That was great. We were very fortunate to welcome Claire Coates, who's been a wonderful colleague and curate here. The first curate here in living memory, I think. And John Bryden took over as Director of Music and really hit the ground running. Do you remember that he opened his first service here with the choir singing that Stanford setting of Psalm 150? It was stunning and great. It was a good year. I'm really grateful to all those who helped make it so. Chief among them, of course, are our wardens, Mary Cooper and Alistair McGregor, who've been marvellous, and I thank them enormously. Under their guidance, 2019 was a harmonious and purposeful year, and they deserve our great thanks. But that briefest of brief summaries is all I want to say about what seems like ancient history now. 2020 started normally enough. It started well even. We had a double baptism on the first Sunday of the year. We started a sermon series on the opening chapters of Acts, which was full of promise. We enjoyed a very special Candlemas festival in a new format as Messy Church did all-age communion. And there was lots more. The year was going with a swing. Then, of course, it all began to fall apart. It began to fall apart as concerns about the virus began to keep people away from church in late February and then early March. And then in mid-March, earlier than the Church of England as a whole, and before the government would have compelled us to do so, we, that is Alistair McGregor, Mary Cooper, Claire Coates and I, we took an emergency decision to shut down our services and activities. I'm hugely grateful to all three of them for making that decision, as well as for their immense efforts in the months that followed. It was a courageous decision, and I suspect that that decision prevented some illness, possibly even death, in our congregation. I say that because we now know that the virus was already among us as a church family. Another week of gatherings might have been disastrous. On the very first Sunday of our lockdown, John Bryden and I put together a very crude online service. We got better at it. The important thing was that we had started. We quickly learnt to use the abilities of the technology, making as much use as we could of changes of venue and angles, incorporating words and pictures, including lots of recordings of people singing and praying and reading and so on. An amazing number of people learnt technical skills and took part both in our Sunday services and in St Andrew's Juniors. I'm really grateful to Claire for taking on that task of producing a more or less weekly output for our junior section, as well as for organising Messy Church online and leading on that front too. As time progressed, we recognised that we had a new congregation. This was amazing. The viewings of our recorded Sunday and Wednesday services never fell below 100 and often exceeded 200. This was totally unexpected. It felt like an endorsement of our decision to present the style and content of services that we had chosen. The content of readings, sermons and prayers were as challenging as they might have been in any setting, but there was a directness and a simplicity with no layers to navigate to get the message. There was no expectation, for example, that newcomers to worship had to learn some new sort of language or get accustomed to ritual or patterns of dress from centuries ago to be able to hear the gospel and access its meaning. That approach was, I think, in tune with our times. Some might bemoan, a lack of willingness to engage, a certain shallowness in society, the demand for instant satisfaction or whatever. But I don't. We're ministering here and now, and society and people's expectations are what they are. To my mind, it is clearer now than ever before that the Word of God, properly read, carefully explained and applied, leading us into prayer and surrounded with music of praise, is a combination used by the Holy Spirit to draw people into the love of God. Of course, we all missed being able to gather together. And one thing in particular that we missed was communion. We debated several times whether we should hold an online communion service, but in the end we did not. I know that ministers in other churches made the opposite decision, but for my part, speaking purely personally, I had a visceral reaction against the image of the priest taking communion alone. There are too many adverse historical overtones, I think, to go back to that. In any event, in our worship in lockdown, we did two things. We used what we had in the technology and its abilities and in our people, and we ensured that the message we delivered was in accessible form. And what we did clearly filled a need both for existing members of the congregation and for others too. I hope too that for many of our existing members it was a glimpse into exciting possibilities of new ways of worshipping. I should also add my thanks to those I've already given to all those who are game enough to get on with using the new technology. I know it was a big step for many. And also to Gwilym Luff, who quietly got on with helping lots of people to access what we were doing. Going forwards, if you or someone you know needs help to get online, please let us know. We don't want anyone to be left out if there is a second lockdown. There were a few left out first time round, despite our best efforts. Now, before moving on to where we go from here, I want to touch on other aspects of our work during lockdown. Pastoral care was a priority. Joan King led a marvellous group of volunteers, both existing pastoral care group members and new volunteers, who phoned everyone on our database. For those who wanted it, those phone calls continued week on week, and there were offers of practical help too. This arrangement was a lifeline for many. in a period of real uncertainty and seriously restricted social contact. Joan and those who put it into effect are unsung heroes of what we've been doing. We also offered our pastoral care services more widely to the village, but there wasn't a great deal of take-up. There was good stuff going on outside of church organisation. As for our youth work, Zoe Clayton's first Sunday was the first Sunday of lockdown. I simply can't imagine a more difficult situation for a young person to walk into than that. But Zoe was great, and she really rose to the challenge. She quickly set up an online offering which developed into a Zoom youth group, and that's proved very successful. And we're now just about to start our first in-person groups since lockdown began. Zoe's working 16 hours a week alongside doing a law degree, which she's just started. Zoe's arrival, of course, was because Zach Britton was leaving us to work full-time for SSYI. What a great hire Zach was. He really deserves our thanks. I'm sorry he didn't get a proper send-off, but he has our sincere and grateful thanks, and it's great that we still see him around as he's working so locally. Music. Now, music has been really important during the pandemic. The contribution of John and all our musicians during lockdown was terrific. And since we've come back, he and the choir have been working hard and making a wonderful contribution to our services, sounding, I think, better and better. Grateful thanks to them all. And we're very much looking forward to the return of those to the choir who haven't been able to come back for health reasons and so on. I think there are really great things ahead. One of our ambitions is to get us once again up to the standard at which we'll be permitted to do occasional evensongs at Ely Cathedral, as we did in the past, when their choirs are on holiday. There's work to be done, but it's definitely a doable ambition. Another person who's been very busy for us all in lockdown is Gillian Sanders, our administrator, as well as continuing with routine stuff, much of which still had to be done. She fought the good fight against photocopier suppliers. The contract on our existing machine was due to run out in August anyway. And also with BT and Virgin to try to get Wi-Fi installed in the church. I can't begin to tell you how difficult it is to deal with these organisations. What a saga it was, but we're almost there. Gillian, in any event, has our grateful thanks for all her efforts during lockdown. Finally, before I turn to where we go from here, I want to mention our safeguarding. Lisa McGregor has been a massive support as Parish Safeguarding Officer. The workload is really immense, and it's been increasing in some ways during the pandemic because everything has to be done in a new way and so has to be reassessed. The current detailed system that we operate is the national church's way of putting right past mistakes. The need for a massive cultural change in this area, in the Church of England as a whole, has never been more apparent than in recent weeks when the report of the independent inquiry has been published. Here in St Andrews, Lisa has ensured we are doing things correctly, but we are still in need of our own cultural shift. Collectively, we need to stop regarding safeguarding as a negative. I still think that is the prevalent idea. It makes a very significant positive contribution to the gospel ministry of the church by ensuring that in this area we love others as we love ourselves and that we are seen to be doing so. We can make things easier for Lisa by involving her early in our planning and then knuckling down to doing what she says is necessary. It's never actually very difficult. There's sometimes a long list of things to do, but it's never difficult. If I may for once be bullish, I have absolutely no sympathy whatsoever with complaints about our safeguarding requirements. And even if I did, it wouldn't matter because none of it's discretionary. Now, back to my main theme. Where do we go from here? As the months went by in lockdown, the question that I and others came to ask was how things might be different when we were once again able to gather. At the start of lockdown, I have to say that I had naively assumed that within a month or 6 weeks, we would be back together and we would simply pick up where we left off. That's what I thought we would do, and you might have thought that too. But as time went on, it became apparent that once we were able to gather, restrictions were going to be placed upon us, which would make that impossible. And what's more, it also became clear to me and others that it would be positively undesirable just to go back to what we were doing before. I perhaps need to put those thoughts in context. A large part of the context is the data, not just the popularity of our online services, but the data that we had preceding lockdown. Ours, unlike some data that we hear about, is pretty reliable. We've paid for an up-to-date version of Excel, so we're not going to run out of rows any time before Jesus returns. If it's a local historian reading this report in 100 years' time, they'll simply have to puzzle out what that's a reference to. From our data, we know that the church has been in numerical decline since the earliest accessible data, which we have, which is from 2006. Sunday attendance then, I've said this before, was around 170 people every Sunday, but it's now about, well, before lockdown was about 90. In 2019, there were some really good signs. Specifically, there was growth in Messy Church. In Messy Church does all-age communion, and in the Connect service. These newer services put our overall averages up markedly. Other services which were doing okay, right at the other end of the modern to traditional spectrum, were our revamped Evensongs and struggling along, but just about holding its own, our BCP communion. But despite huge efforts, we did not see growth in the main morning service. The figures go up and down a little from year to year, but overall, that main mid-morning service seemed to me to be a point of continuing numerical decline. Those of you who used to come to it don't really need me to tell you that if you watched what was happening. It was apparent to us all. On a few occasions, we had fewer seated in the congregation than were robed and participating up front. That doesn't matter of itself, but it was a worrying sign. It seemed to me that this decline, looking back through the figures, albeit with temporary ups and downs, had been continuing since the early 1990s at least. We've got to take this and its implications on board. Our task has always been to bring the good news of Jesus Christ to as many people as possible. There were lots of ways in which our main morning service was really good. It was traditional, orderly worship, but it occupied that main mid-Sunday morning slot that is still the most likely time for people to come to church. It had the main slot, but it didn't speak to our village community, not in the way we had hoped. That, I think, is the conclusion we have to draw from the relative popularity of some other things we do, set against the continuing decline of that service. It's worth adding that we've done what we can with it, within the constraints it has, without being able to change the underlying trend. We have tried and failed. Now, all of that is background. The issue is how things should be different going forwards. I know very well, and I appreciate that at least a few of you do not want to see any change at all. In some ways, I stand with you, not least because it would be easier not to change anything. I also accept that there is something good about, for example, robes and processions and liturgy. There's something comforting about them. They take us back to a more orderly time, real or imagined. There's time for reflection within the service. And change is both disconcerting and hard work. All these things are true, but for my part, I'm convinced that we have to change and that now is the right time to do so. So, what change should we effect? The answer, I think, depends to a degree on what we think the pandemic has taught us. Here's my take on it, in rather short form because this report is too long already. I think it's taught us first that we're capable of great change. That's obvious, but it has also taught us, reminded us perhaps, that change can be for the good. There are lots of aspects of COVID-induced change that society will continue with because they are good. and the same will be true in church. We've learnt too, perhaps we knew it already, that we are capable individually and as a society of great kindness. That's to be remembered because it's easy to be insensitive in what we say, particularly as pandemic fatigue sets in. I've been both a perpetrator and a victim in the last few weeks. I'm resolved to remember to be kind, and I hope you are too. We've been reminded too of the need sometimes, I think it's okay to add sometimes, to put others first. None of us complained, for example, when COVID patients in that first big wave consumed so much of the resources of the NHS. Other things that we might have needed had to wait. Likewise, putting others first in our planning for the church may mean a prioritisation of someone else's needs. The last learning point I would highlight is that public truth and transparency really matter. In our church life, I'm committed to the truth. I'll attempt to give straight answers when I have one, and that caveat is only because the path is not always clear. We're groping our way forwards. So, my COVID learning points in a nutshell: we can deal with change, and we know from experience that it's sometimes good. We can continue to be kind in difficult circumstances. It's sometimes necessary to put the needs of others first, and truth matters and will be honoured. It will be obvious by now that my view is that continuing with our old pattern of services would be a serious error for the church in its mission. I do not think that our main morning service every Sunday should be a communion service, which at its heart has something of the flavour of a members-only ceremony. It's good for Christians to take communion, and we should do so, and we will provide ample opportunities for people to do so more as time goes on. But inquirers cannot fully take part. It would not be good if desires to take communion were so inextricably linked to the main mid-morning service slot as to impact the ability of the church to proclaim the gospel to those who have not yet heard it. Our robes and ritual choreography were, before lockdown, beginning to look very peculiar as the numbers coming to our main service declined. As I said, there were sometimes more people in robes up front doing stuff than there were in the congregation. That was a really odd state of affairs. Current robes and ritual really only came into Church of England in the late 19th century. They are an even more modern invention in the life of this church. They have an honoured place. That variety thing again is really important, but not in every act of worship. We're trying to attract 21st century pilgrims. We've changed the time of the main morning service to 10:30 a.m. There are a few among us who that does not quite suit, and I'm sorry for that, but it is a better time for families and for many others. Our services are generally a bit shorter than when I arrived, so I hope that's some compensation, and we will gradually make an earlier service on a Sunday, a 9 a.m. service, a more regular occurrence. Indeed, a good side effect of the mid-morning change in timing is the ability to make the early service a bit later, moving it from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. It will, incidentally, remain robed with the full traditional dignity that that style of service merits. I know that we only had our first of those services last week, but they will become more common as things settle down. The change in timing of the early service is, I think, likely to be beneficial, both to present members as they go on in years, past evidence shows that that will be so, and to the missional potential of that service amongst older members of our community, something I've always been convinced of. I've concentrated on services because that is where change is most obviously felt. But there are other things we need to do. We desperately need a church communications officer. I've been going on about this for years. Not to do the communications as such, but to ensure that we advertise what we're doing in a timely and appropriate way. We need someone too to ensure that our new methods of fundraising, the card reader and the text messaging and so on, are used well. We need creative and technical input for bits of filming which could really enhance our mission. At the moment, all of these things are a bit ad hoc because I am either doing them or organising them. And on top of all that, we need more support for our home groups, discipleship courses, pastoral groups, new outreach initiatives and more. There are so many opportunities, just so many opportunities to spread the gospel. The bottom line is that whatever gifts you have could be used in the spread of the gospel. Baking and Bible study, anyone? Beer and theology? New mums support group? Grave talk? There's an intriguing one. St Andrew's Saturday cyclists? This pandemic will not last forever. What could you do? Drawing it all together, there's no doubt that this pandemic has shaken us to the core. And though it will not last forever, it's not over yet. But there is an opportunity to be seized, a moment in the spiritual journey of our community which will not be repeated. We'll continue to pursue our aim to be a church for the whole community. We'll continue to reflect on and learn the lessons of the pandemic. Bring these together, the opportunity with the aim and the learning, and we can be that church we want to be, a church which brings the good news of Christ in word and deed to our whole community. Every blessing to you all.